Hey Grace Church, this is the week of the 29th and I want to welcome you to the weekly where we're talking about the death of John the Baptist and what that means to you and I. So in the sermon, we read through Matthew 6 and the verses that talk specifically about how John the Baptist died and how this King Herod, he was actually a governor, he wasn't even a king. I wanted to paint the picture in contrast, the way he lived versus John the Baptist. And even though John the Baptist's death was horrific and was hard and horrible and such a horrible thing to even hear in church or to read on the pages of the Bible, in contrast to John the Baptist and his legacy and his life, we looked at King Herod or Herod and the way he lived his life and how really he was such a humanist and a hedonist and how he lived for pleasure and his desires, and he was self-seeking and he sought after power. He wanted to be king of Israel at the time. And I gave the kind of the goofy illustration that he was a man that lived after money, sex, and rock and roll. And so that's what he lived for. And so it begs the question, as we look at these two figures in biblical history, Herod and John the Baptist, is we look at that and say, how do we want to live? Do we want to live more of the world and self-seeking and after our own stuff and success and pleasure? Or do we want to live on purpose intentionally? And do we ultimately want to live and die for Christ? And so as you heard and have read how John the Baptist died, I mean, he was beheaded and what a horrific thing. But ultimately, that isn't the tragedy. The tragedy isn't how he died. He was a man that lived with the end in mind. He knew he was going to go out a certain way that would be brutal, but he lived on purpose and intentionally. And so as you heard the sermon on Sunday, as you read these scriptures, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about what gospel are you truly following? Because there's all kinds out there, right? There's the gospel of hustle, where our supreme ethic and the purpose of our life is to work and to work hard and to be the most productive people. And working is not a bad thing. It's a very, very good thing. But if if our identity is tied to it, that becomes the gospel of our culture. And there's all different kinds of gospels that we could follow versus the gospel of Jesus. And so it begs the question, how do you want to live? And so I want you to be thinking about that as individuals, and go home and think about it with your spouse and talk about it and pray about how you want to live. Would you live like someone like King Herod, or would you live like John the Baptist? So guys, as you kick off this discussion, I just have a question to pose for you guys. And that's, who is someone you have known, whether personally or maybe not personally, but that just left a lasting legacy. And as you look at that person's legacy, you're just like, I want that. Like, I want that for me. I want to leave that legacy. Who would be that person for you, and discuss as a group? So once you look at this question and discuss, your leader's going to take you through the actual discussion questions. And we love you, Grace Church. We'll see you next week.